Hello, everyone. Welcome to our second Ivy Talk for February to help us celebrate Black History Month. We are so excited to be hosting this talk today and to have you all with us. Thank you for taking time out of this beautiful day to sit at your computer. I am Susie Farmer, the Education Director at Ivy Creek Natural Area and Historic Riverview Farm, and it is my pleasure to welcome all of you all today. This Ivy Talk is honoring the Carr family who lived here at Riverview Farm and worked the land for over 100 years. This farm started with Mr. Hugh Carr, who was able to start purchasing land after he was emancipated from slavery. He and his wife, Miss Texie Mae Hawkins, raised 7 children on this land. The oldest daughter, Mrs. Mary Carr Greer, and her husband, Mr. Conley Greer, worked this land until the 1970s when Mrs. Greer passed away. Today, we honor these families and their hard work and their commitments to their communities. We are excited to have Mr. Michael Carter Jr. He will be speaking today about the history of agriculture in Virginia from an African-American perspective. Mr. Carter is an 11th generation farmer in the United States and is the 5th generation to farm on Carter Farms, his family's Century Farm in Orange County, Virginia, where he gives workshops on how to grow and market ethnic vegetables. In addition, he runs Africulture, a nonprofit dedicated to educating and expounding upon the principles, practices, plants, and people of African descent that has contributed to agriculture. He sits on the board of directors of the Montpelier Descendants Committee, the Virginia Association of Biological Farmers, the Virginia Food Systems Council, the Center for Natural Capital, Virginia Agrarian Trust, and Virginia Food Shed Capital, respectively. He serves as a fellow for the Center for Farm Systems and Community Transportation. Mr. Carter was recognized as a 2020 Audubon Naturalist Society Taking Nature Black Regional Environmental Champion, the 2020 VSU Small Farm Outreach Agent of the Year, and Future Harvest CASA Farmer of the Food Shed for 2021. He acquired an agricultural economics degree from North Carolina A&T State University and has worked in Ghana, Kenya, and Israel as an agronomist. I did not say that word right. An organic agricultural consultant. We are honored and thrilled to have him with us today. Just a couple housekeeping items before we begin. This talk is being recorded and it will be posted to our website in a few days. Please mute yourself if you have not done so. And please put your questions in the chat box and we will answer them as they come in. We will also address questions at the end. And without further ado, Michael, I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you. Good morning or afternoon or evening, wherever you are in the world right now watching this. My name is Michael Carter Jr. with Carter Farms and Africulture. Thank you again for spending some time with me on this lovely February summer day. This weather is a whole other conversation and workshop we can talk about in terms of climate change, global warming, and the new nature of our climate and what we need to do to protect that. So that'd be another workshop and conversation we'll have in another couple of months, I guess. I'm going to put my screen on and begin our presentation. As stated earlier, please, if you have any questions that in relationship to what we're discussing in the presentation, please put them in the chat. I'll do my best to answer them. I do try to answer those questions in the chat as we move forward, or at least as we go through. I wanted to be in context with what we're discussing, so I don't have to necessarily go back and kind of revive everybody about what we were discussing per a question that would have related to something early on in the presentation. I'm gonna share my screen. Just give me a second, as this is the customary Zoom pause. All right.
All right, I'm fine.
Very good. And this is a presentation and workshop, a collection of historical analysis that we have done over the last, I don't know, 2 or 3, 4 years. It started with a presentation by Ms. Chantel Bingham of Charlottesville Food Justice Network, or formerly of Charlottesville Food Justice Network, and my another partner, Mr. Deron Chavis of Happily Natural Day in Richmond, Virginia, and myself, collaborating to give a greater historical analysis of the African-American experience in agriculture, specifically to Virginia. Now, this is usually about an 8-day course that we walk through the laws and the history of Virginia, starting back to the 1600s and coming full circle. I'm not going to take that much time today. So we're going to start roughly around 1865, 1860 actually, till present day, and just kind of walk you through some of the realities, some of the things that you may not have never considered about agriculture, that you may not have known about certain laws, and give you a different context and a different purview. One of the things that I try to do when I'm speaking is reduce and eliminate all emotion and just deal with strictly facts. Emotional conversations can get us in our emotions where we're not listening to each other or we're not being heard by others. So I found that it's best that we have a factual basis that we are speaking from, where these are the facts, these is the information or the truths that we're presenting, and then you can take with it and do what you want to do with it. I'm open to any and all questions. When I'm speaking, please ask those questions, like I said, in the chat. I'll answer them if they're relevant to this conversation. If I feel like they're not too relevant to the conversation and they may derail me and I will definitely go into a tangent, then I'll probably say that for the end. I expect to probably be done in about an hour and 30 minutes, and then we'll say the last 20 to 30 minutes for greater questions. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak at this Ivy Talk. And before I begin, I want to take a moment of silence and remembrance to acknowledge our ancestors, to acknowledge the spirit and legacy of Mr. Hugh Carr, Mrs. Texie Mae Hawkins, Mr. Conley Greer, my grandmother who passed away in October, my Uncle Joe who passed away last month, and my cousin Jeff who passed away yesterday. Always acknowledging those shoulders upon which we stand and acknowledging those individuals who've influenced us to be able to speak and share today. We'll just take a moment to acknowledge those ancestors. So again, acknowledging those spirits in whichever form or fashion they may be in, that we know that they're doing what they needed to do to get us to this point. All those individuals who did everything they could to be what's good and right to and for us in this day. And my story begins in Orange County, Virginia. This is where my family's from and has been here for the last few hundred years. My family's history dates back to roughly the first plantation in America, the Shirley Plantation. And I would dare say some of my ancestral legacy goes back to Angola, southern Congo and northern Angola. So we could have very well been some of the first individuals to arrive here in America potentially between 1605 and 1500s on up. Many of the enslaved or indigenous servants at the time came here through Mexico and other places in the non-English colonized areas of what we know today as the United States and in North American continent. But in 1860, my great-great-grandfather, to the sixth power, Mr. Robert Ellis, he started a community called Freetown of about 8 families in a place called Lahore, which is a small portion off of Marquis Road now and Lahore Road in Orange County, Virginia. My great-grandfather started this with, again, 8 other families and about 18 acres of land. This is where our beloved cook and the grand dame of Southern cooking, Miss Edna Lewis, is home to. That was her hometown there in Freetown. She's a distant cousin of ours. And you'll see to the left, the highlighted portion where it says Robert Ellis. I don't know how it was transpired, if he was an owner of individuals for the sake of the records and for the sake of keeping his family together, or if that's the name of his owner himself. But I believe from the date on this that he would have potentially been considered a owner of enslaved people for the sake of, and own those 8 families to keep them free in that space during the time period of 1860, which is before the Civil War. To the right, the young lady there is my great-grandmother, Mr. Robert Ellis's granddaughter. Her name was Courtney Ellis, and great-grandmother is about the 4th power. So again, our history goes back, and if you watch most of the records of my family, we always state that we were farmers. So as I stated in my bio, I'm an 11th generation farmer in America. My family has been doing this for a very long time in terms of our relationship to the land. And we'll fast forward to 1861 and the first 13th Amendment of the Constitution. And this is a unique aspect of the 13th Amendment of the Constitution that most people don't know. And it has a lot to do with how we got here. The first 13th Amendment of the Constitution pretty much stated that Congress would not be able to interfere or abolish slavery in any state in the Union. And this was the 15th president's, James Buchanan's, position to try to keep the Union together. So he was willing to put it all on the line and concede to the Southern states' demands about making slave a states' rights issue, or slavery a states' rights issue. So this particular act or amendment was passed by both the House and the Senate. And the only reason it did not become law is because President Abraham Lincoln was sworn in the next day. So James Buchanan could not sign it before he was before President Lincoln was inaugurated in office. And Mr. Lincoln also stated and understood this was a proposal that's put on the table. I was willing to sign this as well, but South Carolina seceded from the Union and it made this 13th Amendment null and void. And we also know that the later 13th Amendment came in and was passed. But this gives you an idea of the context of how the African American was treated and was looking to be treated despite what was going on in the country. That the true devotion or the true commitment to the country was to keep the Union together at whatever cost. And that meant to keep people enslaved eternally, or acquiesce and again fight this war to keep the Union together as well, which is what later happened. And right around this time as well, 1862, the United States Department of Agriculture was created. May 15th, 1862, it was created, and it was created in the middle of a civil war. A unique time to create the largest department in the country at that time. And now it's the second largest department in the country next to the Department of Defense. And why was it created? Lincoln believed that the agriculture at the time was the largest interest in the nation. It should have a proper department. I would dare say he also foresaw that if the Union won, in which they did, the agriculture economy would change quite a lot because of not having free or enslaved people to do the work of this great industry that had made America great and probably the #1 nation in the country or in the world at that time. So the USDA was created to support the farmers who were supporting the army. The Civil War came down to a war of supplies and munitions, and food was a considerable asset and a war measure that was needed to supply individuals on the front lines to be able to take care of themselves, to feed themselves, to allow them to fight the opposing side, whether it be the Confederate side or the Union side. In addition to that, we had the addition or the creation of the Morrill Act of 1862. And this is the act that created the land grant, or some people call it the land grab university system. Virginia Tech is one of those land grant universities in the state of Virginia, as well as Virginia State University. 1862 also saw us having the Homestead Act, which was one of the first acts that provided a kind of a subsidy for individuals in the United States. And the Homestead Act provided anyone over the age, and by anyone, it didn't mean everyone. It meant anyone they felt worthy of owning land. Anyone over the age of 17 who did not fight against the Union was eligible to apply to receive 160 acres of public land. This was land stolen from the indigenous nations throughout the Midwest and throughout the West. If it granted the acreage, settlers would be required to live on the land for 5 years and make improvements to the land, such as building a house and planting crops. 160 acres of free land provided to individuals for just existing. And granted, this was not provided to all individuals, but we'll go through that in just a little bit. And at the same time, a few years later, you had the Southern Homestead Act, where 246 million acres of land was taken from indigenous nations and the land acquired from Mexico and dispersed mainly among white families. We had an exodus or a tremendous influx of English or European immigrants coming to America. They made up, between them and white Americans, they made up 99.73% of the recipients of the Southern Homestead Act. Up to 93 million individuals today, citizens today, are still direct benefactors of the largest welfare program in American history. $1.2 trillion of wealth transferred during this time period of this particular act. And that's really a modest amount. And I just equated that to 246 million acres of land provided at $5,000 per acre. And many of us know, if you ever bought land or you have land, $5,000 per acre now valued is probably a very low price for land. So you can imagine that, what that true value is, especially in urban areas in the Midwest, as well as farmland in the Midwest as well. So it's a tremendous wealth transfer and wealth creation opportunity for a lot of Americans. However, not all Americans were allowed to participate in it. And here's a little bit of a Civil War factoid, just to give you some insight into who fought for the freedom of this nation during the Civil War. And these individuals literally turned their plowshares into swords. Over 209,165 African Americans fought in the Union Army. And this is what's documented on their rolls. They also made up 25% of the US Navy, which constituted roughly about 25,000 individuals, both male and female. The US Navy didn't keep records according to race for their sailors. So we only have the records of 25%, which is what the Navy says what roughly that it contributed to, the African-American population contributed to. And the United States colored troops played a tremendous role in acquiring their own freedom. They literally fought for their literal freedom. And in that process, they toppled Richmond in April of 1865, were led into the battle at Richmond by Black troops, and roughly 13 regiments of Black troops came in and fought the Confederate Army, and made General Lee, not surrender, but leave Richmond, give up the capital, and then head down to Appomattox, where he was stopped by another 13 regiments of Black soldiers, who, along with other Union soldiers led by General Grant, stopped these individuals from proceeding any further, made them wave the white flag, and ultimately surrender at the Battle of Appomattox. But the job wasn't done there. From there, many of these regiments also trekked to Texas to ensure Texas did not become or regather steam to build up troops to bring more resistance to the Union. So Pendleton Murrah, who was the Texas governor at the time, was trying to gather up the last remaining holdouts of the Confederacy and kind of regroup and reattack the Union again. But these United States colored troops came in and pushed these individuals out of Texas and into Mexico, making Texas the last Confederate stronghold. This goes against some of the notions about Juneteenth and what happened during Juneteenth. What happened during Juneteenth was not an individual coming and informing individuals that they were free. During Juneteenth, United States colored troops freed these individuals by enforcing the Emancipation Proclamation, which had to be enforced in order for it to be put in place. The only way it could be enforced was to make sure that rebelling states were now brought back into the Union. So this is what happened. This is how Juneteenth became a thing. And slavery officially didn't end until December 31st, 1865, when the last enslaved Africans were freed per the 13th and 14th Amendments when they were passed. And agriculturally, we were moving in a different direction as African Americans. There's approximately 4 million formerly enslaved individuals who were promised through Special Field Order number 15, 40 acres and a mule. Many of us may have heard this story or this promise. Spike Lee's famous film company is called 40 Acres and a Mule. You hear individuals demanding, when they're talking about reparations, demanding 40 acres and a mule. This was a condition that was agreed upon by General Sherman with Southern Black leaders, namely in South Carolina. It was discussed about restitution for the enslaved. And in this restitution for the enslaved, this was the agreement that was agreed upon. However, it was never passed into law. Therefore, actually, it was passed into law. It was overturned by Jackson, the gentleman who followed up, the president who followed up after Abraham Lincoln. This particular acquisition of land would have increased the amount of assets in the African American community by about $800 billion at minimum, and would have been a tremendous land bank for the community. Because this didn't happen, we didn't have that to rely on. But we were giving another promise during this time period as well. But before we go there, we have an infomercial here. And you'll see these throughout my presentation. There'll be a couple of different infomercials here, just to give you a break and kind of help you to see how you can support and kind of take your mind off of what we're talking about at the time. So how do you support Black farmers in Virginia and throughout the country? Support Black farmers. One of the best ways to do that is through the VirginiaBlackFarmerDirectory.com. You can also support us through BlackFarmersIndex.com, as well as the ArcRepublic.com. These are all websites that list Black farmers in the state and the region and the country. VirginiaBlackFarmerDirectory.com is strictly for Virginia. So if you're in Virginia, this would be your best directory. The Black Farmers Index and ArcRepublic provide resources or links to Black farmers throughout the country based upon region. And these are a few of the Black farmers in the Piedmont that you can support. Vanguard Ranch in Louisa County, Virginia. Fitrod Farms in Gordonsville, Virginia. Carter Farms, my farm. Cattle Run Farms, which is in Greene County, Virginia. Farmer D's Farm, which is in Culpeper. Sweet Vine Farm Winery, my farm neighbor, my farm sister. She's in Unionville, Virginia as well. If you get a chance to go to her winery, it's an extraordinary place to go and taste very unique but delicious wines. She's the first Black woman-owned winery in the state of Virginia, and she's a third-generation winemaker. In addition, you can go to Minority and Veteran Farmers of the Piedmont. They'll be doing a Ivy Talk with you all next month to kind of expound further upon what we do and how we do. I'm a member of the Minority and Veteran Farmers of the Piedmont as well. So this infomercial is sponsored by these Black farmers. And moving into 1865 to 1965. We start 1865 off with the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Most people are not familiar with the Civil Rights Act, but it gives everybody in this country the right to citizenship. The first United States federal law to define citizenship and affirm that all citizens are equally protected by the law. I put this in here because this was the law that was passed and in place. However, it was never enforced, because soon after that, there became an era that was called the Jim Crow era, which didn't allow for individuals to be protected by the law. Some people call it the Jim Crow era. I prefer to call it the blackface era because that's what Jim Crow was. Jim Crow was a song about mocking Black people in what became to be known as blackface by utilizing cork, burnt cork, to rub on your face, using bright red makeup to highlight lips, and usually mocking individuals, Black people, about how they dance, how they move, perpetuating stereotypes. In addition, you had the Black codes during this time period that restricted Black people's right to own property, conduct business, buy and lease land, and move freely throughout public spaces. Black codes also enforced vagrancy laws, what we would call vagrancy laws was if you didn't work for a white person, you were pretty much locked up. You had to have a job with a white person in order not to be put in jail and also be worked in prisons and in chain gangs against your will. Vagrancy laws turned into many times loitering laws, you still see today. Where my time in West Africa, loitering was a thing. Like that's what people just did. It wasn't loitering, it was just people hanging out. And I think in most countries, it's that way. But in America, because of this law, you had to be doing something productive that a white person deemed to be worthy of work. So you would not be arrested. Many Black Southerners also became sharecroppers, utilizing their skills as farmers to become or to be able to provide income for their families. Sharecropping was a very unique cropping system in which, you pretty much gave all your resources to someone and you had to trust them to be fair when those goods were sold. And in that fairness, it usually wasn't fair. Usually wasn't fair at all. So sharecropping was a disadvantage to a lot of Black farmers, but they still made it through and still made the most of those situations. Then we had the creation of the Freemans Bureau and the Freemans Savings Bank. The Freemans Bureau was a tremendous opportunity that was blown. The Freemans Bureau would have given African Americans a banking system that was secure and would allow them to save money and ultimately build wealth, create legacy for them and their family. After their horrific experience in chattel slavery, this was an opportunity to make it right again. But unfortunately, it was mismanaged. And it was mismanaged by Mr. Henry Cook. We don't hear about as much because many times the premise or the stereotype around the Freeman's Bureau is that Black people mismanage the money. And that was not the case at all. Mr. Henry Cook, who was put over the Bureau, was a speculator, a railroad speculator, a white man, him and his brother, a white investor and a white overseer of this fund. And they speculated on the railroad. And when they speculated or bet on the railroad, they lost. And ultimately, they lost the $3 million worth of savings that the 61,000 or so Black farmers and Black landowners and newly freed African Americans had invested into the bank. Not even invested into the bank, deposited into the bank, hoping that it would be, a bank and it would hold their money accordingly. So a lot of people ended up putting money and faith in the government, in this government institution called the Freeman Savings Bank, and lost everything they had. And this created a mindset of not trusting the government, especially around finances. So you find that soon after this, a lot of African Americans stopped putting money in banks. You find that folks will put money underneath their mattress. You'll find the mother of the family keeping money in a bra strap, keeping money in her stockings or sock for a rainy day because they didn't trust the banks because of this particular arrangement here with the Freeman's Bureau. And none of this money was FDIC insured at the time. That was not a law that was in place. So all that money was lost. Mr. Cook was prosecuted, but never really found guilty, never had to return any of the money. And the only individuals who actually lost were the African Americans who put their money into the bank. And following that, you had the compromise of 1877 that did end what's called the Reconstruction era. So Philip Buchanan, in exchange for removing federal troops from the South, was elected as president of the United States. And this was a compromise made. There was a stalemate in the electorates at that time period, and they made a deal. The Republicans at that time made a deal with the Democrats or the Dixiecrats at that time. But the only way that the Dixiecrats would allow Philip Buchanan to be elected was to remove the federal troops out of the South, and ultimately ending the Reconstruction era and putting the individuals who rebelled against the United States back into power. And this gentleman here is a unique man that doesn't get talked about enough in terms of his approach to making things right with both the Black farmers and just the larger Black community. And his name is Mr. William or General or Senator William Mahone. General William Mahone was a Confederate general based out of Virginia, born in Southampton County, Virginia, was an ardent Confederate supporter, was also a railroad magnate. He was wealthy and considered to be a really good general. The most famous battle was the Battle of Crater, which is in Petersburg, in which there was I'm not going to go through the Civil War history, but if you know the Battle of the Crater, it's over there near Fort Lee in Petersburg, Virginia. And Ms. Mahone is acknowledged with Route 460 going towards Southampton County, Virginia. If you ever go that way south through Ivor and down towards Southampton County, Virginia, 460 is named after Mr. General William Mahone. And it was considered to be a successor for General Robert E. Lee, if he had to move up in the government or been killed in battle. Robert E. Lee said he had developed the highest qualities for organization and command. As referred to later on in his life, he was considered by Virginia Democrats as the Roman traitor Catalan, referred to by John Mercer Langston, African-American congressman, as Moses, and called himself a self-described Napoleon. But what he did politically was change the course of Virginia politics and Virginia history by working with the African-American that he fought against during the Civil War. He created a party called the Readjuster Party. And this Readjuster Party was started in 1879 and was a coalition of Black and white Republicans and white Democrats. And he worked across racial lines, across class lines to provide opportunities for both individuals. This was probably one of the biggest and most well-known, but least talked about, not even well-known, least talked about realities of Virginia politics, of Black people, of white people, of economically deprived people coming together to work toward a common goal. So during this time period, Virginia was in debt because of the Civil War. And the Readjuster Party established a new way of dealing with this debt through not taxing the poor and then giving more money toward public schools. So at the peak, they controlled the state legislature. They controlled the state courts. They also controlled the governorship, which means the governor was also a readjuster. 2 of the readjusters represented Virginia in the US Senate, and 6 represented 10 congressional districts in Congress. This was the peak time for African Americans in this time period, and it was nothing seen like this again until the 1990s with the election of Governor Wilder, I guess 1988. But this was an awesome time period politically. We saw a great increase in Black political power, saw a great increase in Black-white unity amongst each other, working together toward different goals and different projects. The party was majority Black in membership, promoted African-American citizenship, political power, suffrage, meaning voting rights, and the capacity for African-Americans to hold public office. This was also seen to be a threat and created one of the greatest or largest riots in Virginia called the Danville Riot. It took place in Danville, Virginia in 1882. And this riot was because of African-Americans having control of the Danville community. What they also did was ban chain gangs and whipping posts. And most of the folks who were part of chain gangs were probably African-American. Most of the people who suffered lashes and punishments at the whipping post was mostly African-Americans. They reinvested in public education by changing up the taxes so that the poor wouldn't have to pay taxes, but still be able to get education, or wouldn't have to pay as much taxes to get education. He empowered the lower economic class by separating school taxes from the ability to vote, and provided infrastructure improvements. And we walk on some of those infrastructure improvements today. Some of the paved streets, the paved roads, adding sidewalks, and modernizing the water system at that time. And Mr. Alfred Harris, or Delegate Alfred Harris. And I like Mr. Harris, Delegate Harris, because one, we share the same birthday, August 19th. So I'm grateful for him and his Leo ways, because he led like a Leo does. That's what we do. But Delegate Alfred Harris, he put forth a bill that would create what's known as Virginia Normal and Collegiate Institute. Virginia Normal and Collegiate Institute was the bill, or was the university that will become Virginia State University. Virginia State University is where my father went, where my uncles went, where my sister went, where my great uncles went, where my cousins went. Virginia State University has a very high place in my family for the education. And Delegate Harris is the one who passed or proposed the bill to the House of Delegates that allowed it to be passed into a university for African-American students. And this was done and promoted by the Readjuster Party under William Mahone, creating an institution of higher learning I think this is also where Mr. and Mrs. Greer went. So this is, Virginia State University was where they went as well, I believe. So this was the premier institution for higher learning as a 1890, at least became that way in the 1920s. At this time, it wasn't considered part of the 1890 structure, which we'll talk about in just a second, of a land grant university. At the time, Hampton University was the land grant university of the day. If you ever read the book Up from Slavery by Booker T. Washington, he'll speak about Hampton University in great context and great glory. And he talks about the agricultural prowess that Mr. General Armstrong, who founded Hampton University, had in terms of taking care of their community. So Hampton University was the first land grant university, HBCU land grant university in America or in Virginia. And then it switched over to Virginia State in the 1920s. But Delegate Harris helped to create and form Virginia State University, served on its board of visitors, among other things. And then you had the Colored Agricultural and Industrial Association of Virginia. This is a national organization based on a fusion movement among Black Republicans and white populists. The Virginia chapter was founded on August 22nd of 1890 among Black and white farmers. And the object or the goal of the organization was to create a market for what the farmers produce and to obtain at cheaper rates what they purchase. So this ideally was a interracial cooperative. And they expected to accomplish this by uniting together and establishing exchanges throughout the state at which they can buy and sell at wholesale prices. So they're really trying to create a cooperative 20, 30 years before the first cooperative started officially in America through the federal government. So this Colored Agriculture Industrial Association of Virginia was a really progressive group at the time. However, it was very short-lived. It died out by 1892. The racial politics of the day really triumphed over the idea of fusion or the readjusters. The readjuster movement, the fusion movement, which are all trying to unite the races together, were not supported by the larger populace, but not supported by the white farmers. And if they did support them, they were castigated and chastised, usually segregated to a certain extent. So it wasn't worth their time or energy to support these movements of unification when it was a bigger benefit to them and their farms and their families to be separate, to engage in the national or state policy of segregation. And these gentlemen don't get talked about enough in the right context. From an agricultural perspective, they saved Virginia agriculture. And that would be Dr. Booker T. Washington and Dr. George Washington Carver. They played instrumental roles, both Dr. Booker T. Washington being a native of Virginia and being enslaved in Virginia and going to Hampton University in Virginia, and then taking his talents, his brilliance, his order to Tuskegee to create Tuskegee Institute. The creation of Tuskegee Institute gave a different type of prowess for African-American farmers. Many of the African-American farmers of the day were not respected, not because they didn't have the knowledge, but because of the cultural implications at the time and the perceptions about agriculture. One of the things that we do at Africulture is really try to challenge the perceptions and the stereotypes that still persist today around African-Americans and agriculture. This perception is rooted greatly in the institution of slavery and ultimately our worldview and our economic view of agriculture being a very lowly occupation and vocation. But Dr. Carver and Dr. Washington challenged this ideal by allowing greatness to be explored and exploited at that university and then passed around to other 1890s. This is Black History Month, so you generally get stories about Booker T. Washington. You hear little snippets about Dr. Carver. And what most of us know about Dr. Carver, what we call the peanut guy. That's what students would call them around the country. The peanut guy. The only time you really hear about Dr. Carver is around Black History Month, and usually in something in relationship to some basics of the peanuts. And he created so many different ways to create the peanut. But his creation or his work with the peanut was not for the peanut's sake. It was for the American agriculture's sake. So his work with the peanut was more so geared around the idea of saving American agriculture. The peanut was an African crop, or the groundnut was both an African crop and a South American crop, but it was ultimately a legume. And he was helped to America to restore or better understand its practices with what we know today as conservation agriculture. The original conservationists of this land in Virginia and all throughout the United States were indigenous peoples. And the indigenous peoples were ran off the land, as we know, through colonization, through treaties and wars, et cetera. So the agricultural knowledge of how to preserve and do agriculture properly, especially in conservation, in America was not known because we had ran off those stewards who understood how to do this and do it effectively and had done it for eons here in America. So Dr. Carver employed a lot of these principles, not to just grow peanuts, but to save agriculture. So these are just some of the things he introduced within agriculture that ultimately, again, saved and shaped American agriculture and made American agriculture the leading agricultural nation in the world in the late 1800s into the early 1900s and continuing to this day. So he reinstituted crop rotation with legumes, in which if you grew something, a heavy feeder like cotton or corn, you would plant legumes behind it to restore the soil. This is one of the practices he used with the peanut. But because most people didn't know what a peanut was and how to use the peanut, he also became the father of what's called value-added production. So that's why he created 300 and some different uses for the peanut, 100, 200 some different uses for the sweet potato. These products were not in the mainstream American lexicon of what we utilize as food or any other products. So he was showing the farmers and ultimately industry how to utilize these plants to get the most out of these plants. We have an abundance of them, we have a surplus of these plants, and he utilized these plants to create what's called value-added products, making honey into lip balm and all that kind of things. He also reintroduced cover cropping, utilizing sweet potato. He established the Cooperative Extension Service officially with a technology, a wagon called the Jessup wagon, where we utilize a Jessup wagon to go to various parts of remote rural areas of Alabama to share information. He would share his Carver bulletins, his research with these farmers. He would share what he was doing with the peanut. He would share what he was doing with the sweet potato. He would share how to prepare these items, all these different items for the farmers to be able to have a better understanding of how to utilize these crops and how to get to maximize or how to maximize their land and ultimately the produce they created. And this was also considered to be technical assistance. So it also created technical assistance for farmers. He instituted soil conservation practices. Interestingly enough as well, he created the first biofuels. In 1903 at the World Fair in America, there was a gentleman named Rudolph Diesel who came to America looking for Mr. Carver to create a fuel for his engine. And Mr. Carver utilized peanut oil, go figure, as fuel for the first quote unquote diesel engine. And there was supposed to be a partnership eventually with Rudolph Diesel and Tuskegee to produce fuel for this particular diesel engine. Unfortunately, when Mr. Diesel returned back to Europe, he was a victim of a mishap, ended up floating in the English Channel and did not make it. And ultimately, diesel fuel became a product that came out as opposed to a plant-based fuel of diesel engine. However, if you ever have a diesel engine, I used to do this all the time when I had a diesel engine, you can still run vegetable oil in a diesel engine, especially in the summertime. In the wintertime, it can clog up the shafts a little bit because it's compression based. It can clog up the glow plug, not the glow plugs, but anyway, I'm losing my train of thought there. But diesel fuel or vegetable oil can still be used very much today as a fuel for diesel engines. He's introduced the peanut to the American consumer, was the father of organic agriculture, and also the father of agriculture conservation and preservation. You can learn more about the Jessup wagon. Google it. If you ever make it to Tuskegee, Tuskegee has a George Washington Carver museum at Tuskegee. But the Jessup wagon was a unique vehicle in which he understood that he needed to get to his farmers. And he utilized that vehicle, which initially was horse-powered and then became motorized as the time presented itself, to be able to reach farmers in very remote areas. So Dr. George Washington Carver was one of those great agricultural geniuses that, because of a Virginia man's push, Dr. Booker T. Washington became a icon in the agriculture industry. Here's another commercial here of some of the African crops that change American agriculture, consumer habits and preferences. And these are just a few of the products that have come from Africa, or products for this part, animals that came from Africa, that were part and parcel of the American lexicon in terms of produce and what we eat on a regular basis. The cow is a unique one. The cow comes from an ancient African animal called the auroch. The auroch was considered to be a wilder version of the cow, and it was soon domesticated in Egypt and in Northeast Africa and Rwanda and Kenya into what's called taurine cattle and Boss cattle. These cattle are the grandfathers of the cattle we know today: the Angus, the Holstein, the Jersey, all those other cattle. Coffee is from Ethiopia. Most of us can't live a day without coffee. We depend on it on a regular basis. And coffee is a product and a plant of Ethiopia. Coffee is one of those items that Ethiopians value greatly. Ethiopians say they have the best coffee in the world. I'm not a coffee drinker, so I can't necessarily verify that. But coffee, again, is one of those products that come from from East Africa, and generally not known about that's where its origins are from. The cola nuts. The cola nuts provided us with the great invention of what we know today as Coca-Cola or cola. They spelled it differently. Cola nut in West Africa spelled K-O-L-A. For marketing purpose, Coca-Cola became C-O-L-A because they could do the little curvy thing with the C when they made the logo. But cola nuts is a nut or a seed that grows in West Africa off a tree. And this nut is high in caffeine. When I worked in West Africa, my security men would bite cola nuts to keep them up at night. It's the equivalent to, like, instead of 5-hour energy, like 5-day energy. It keeps you up a lot. And still served very much. You can still find cola nuts and bitter cola nuts in markets throughout West Africa. Jute was the first main fabric of colonial America. Many bags and ropes were made out of jute, especially in the colonial period. It was probably one of the most valuable plants, jute and hemp. Hemp is also another crop that's from West Africa, hemp/marijuana. Indigo and cotton, other African crops that created a whole industry. Cotton was a king, as they call it, King Cotton. But you add that with indigo, and then you have denim. And the denim industry came out of two African crops. The commercial production of cocoa came from West Africa as well, with Tete Kwashi, who started the first commercial farms in West Africa, in Ghana, West Africa, and Tete Kwashi in Ghana became the #1 producer of cocoa in the late 1800s, all the way up to like yesterday. Ivory Coast and Ghana have been the #1 and #2 producers of cocoa since the late 1800s. The majority of the cocoa and chocolate that we get come from West Africa. It's not marketed as such. Most of it, when we think of cocoa, we think of Cadbury bunnies, Godiva, Hershey's, Hershey Park, M&M's, all that. But the product comes from West Africa. Vanilla, peanuts, gumbo. Gumbo is another one. Gumbo is actually the Senegalese name or the Wolof name for okra. So when individuals saying they were making gumbo, they were really making okra stew. And because individuals didn't take the time to understand what they meant by gumbo, gumbo became a national phenomenon. So these are just some of the contributions that African crops have made in the American dietary lexicon. And again, the Morrill Act of 1890 prohibited distribution of money. It created the Hampton University and Virginia State University as land grant universities. And going into the 1900s, you see the rise of the African American farmer. And if you see highlighted on your screen, this is agriculture census from 1900. And you can see Virginia was leading the nation in farmers. Virginia had 26,566 Black farmers in the state at the turn of the 20th century, 1900. Had more Black farmers than every other state in the country at the time. And not just more Black farmers, but almost 60% of those Black farmers were actually Black owners. So a majority of those farmers owned the land they worked. And moving forward, in 1925, Virginia had over 50,000 Black farmers. You can see where it says highlighted, all non-white farmers or non-white operators. You see that's the census. If you look up at the top of that, 1925, 50,147 Black farmers. So the Black farmers were growing, and they were growing exponentially, and not just growing, but was successful at what they were doing. But in the success came a lot of adversarial energy, spirits, actions that came along with their growth. Because in their growth, they were able to be much more self-sufficient, were able to have economic independence from the discrimination that they were facing on a regular basis. And this process, around this time period, is when my family acquired another portion of our land. As I said, my great-grandfather, the sixth power, they acquired land in 1860 with his great-granddaughter, Catherine Walker Shirley, and her husband, Jefferson Davis Shirley, acquired our family property November 5th, 1910 for $722.05. In addition to that, their son-in-law, my great-grandfather, John Lewis Carter, acquired another piece of property about 5 miles away from my family property in Orange, another part of Orange on Shirley Road, ironically, 25 acres for approximately $225. So this time period, African Americans were buying land in a great deal and building communities around land. Most of the African American and African American communities were growing. Most of us have heard of Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. You may have heard of some communities in Ocala, Florida, Wilmington, North Carolina, et cetera. But there were Black Wall Streets all over the South. These individuals were thriving because they had a circular economy in which they spent money with strictly themselves, and they created industries around themselves. They created insurance industries and hair care products. All the money was recycling back in their community, creating an immense amount of wealth amongst these individuals. And in retaliation to that, you saw a dramatic rise, increase in lynchings. Over 4,000 lynchings happened between 1875 and 1955. And lynchings were public and not so public murders of African men, women, and children. And white-leaning or white-supporting men, women, and children. This was vigilant juvenile justice, where mobs were, formed, and they would need to execute their justice regardless of regardless of court. They took the law into their own hands. Innocent men, women, and children were lynched. Babies were cut out of pregnant mothers' stomachs and hanged with their umbilical cords. Any unfathomable thing that could be done was almost always done. And it became a public event with postcards were created where pieces of body parts were handed out as souvenirs for the lynchings. These were incredible acts of terror that many times the only crime that the individuals were really guilty of was being successful, of minding their own business, of doing what they could do based upon, what the law is set for, and what some would term as uppityness. That was the reason for many of these lynchings. Black uppityness. You were being too uppity. You were being too successful. You smiled at someone. You didn't walk on the sidewalk when I came down the street. Black communities, neighborhoods, and towns were razed to the ground. Some of those communities were literally drowned, were literally placed underwater. Land was stolen via terror. There was a whole lot of handwritten deeds that made adjustments and put things in people's name without any type of permission, any type of legal act without any money exchanging whatsoever. Not one person in this particular time period or institution was committed, or was persecuted or found guilty of these acts. Over 4,000 murders. Not one person was found guilty of any of these acts. And this created a sense of terror. This created for Black farmers and Black farming families and communities, a flight from the South to the North, trying to find a better social environment where their success wouldn't be held against them. And this is a map of the lynchings. And you can see the rise of those lynchings happening really around 1919, 1920. There was a tremendous increase in these type of crimes against this community. And so you saw, and you can almost see a rise, and you saw a little bit, I got to do greater work and research on this, correlation between the amount of Black ownership, Black land ownership, and then rise of lynchings or the increase of lynchings in various areas. It's almost always part and parcel of the realities of that day, that the more successful you became, minding your own business, supporting your own community, doing what they allowed you to do in terms of spending your money with your own community, the higher probability you were of being victimized for doing such. So agriculture and success became synonymous with death and terror for many Black communities, that you could not be successful, that you had to pretend to be poor just so you wouldn't be attacked, just so you wouldn't have your land taken. And it wasn't just an assault on the people, it was an assault on things we ate. Watermelon was literally weaponized against the Black community. And most of us, I'm sure on this call, has probably seen these tropes in some way, shape, or form. And this was as common a thing to see in the 1900s as Facebook or YouTube ads today. They were everywhere. You would see them all the time. Any type of, in the news, movies, television, commercials. You would constantly, in stores, on the covers of whatever your favorite household products were. Many of them had very much images like this, mocking the African American. Why was the watermelon used and weaponized? Because the watermelon provided a lot of these farmers a lot of financial benefit. The watermelon was relatively easy to grow for a lot of the Black farmers because the watermelon is an African crop, and it doesn't take as much to grow if you know what you're doing. Watermelon also has a high level of perishability. It doesn't go rotten or go bad early on or very quickly. It takes some time for watermelons to get to rot, to go bad after you harvest them. So in this reality, they weaponized the watermelon to really affect the consumers and the producers, because the consumers didn't think the watermelon was something they wanted to consume anymore. That would cut back on one of those cash crops that the African-American farmer would have. That was in Virginia, that was in North Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, Florida, etc. And to this day, and I've seen it on shows like Curb Your Enthusiasm, where they still have these conversations because there's a stigma that's 4 and 5 generations deep of not consuming watermelon or not consuming watermelon in front of white people. And people still feel a certain way because of these images that were put out to really discourage the support of Black farmers and the consumption of a very healthy, nutritious African fruit. And this picture here is this is in Richmond, Virginia, in the early 1900s. These men have look like Black Diamond, watermelons, and Crenshaw melons. And again, a very successful enterprise where these individuals, I'm sure, made decent money doing this and could support them and their families. So this became a propaganda attack on Black farmers about how we perceive the food that we ate, and ultimately how, because white people made fun of us, we ultimately took offense to that and allowed it to affect our self-esteem and ultimately our dietary choices, and tried to line up our dietary choices toward European likes and appreciation. And again, this has continued on to this very day, where people still get offended if you give them, African Americans may still get offended if you give them something watermelon flavored. as a white person. You know, there's a, well, I won't go into that, but there are definitely some issues with watermelon and the African American community in terms of consumption around white people. Another image that we face as African Americans was the image of the mammy. And Jemima just recently got removed from boxes of cereal or boxes of, or was it maple syrup or pancake mix, just like last year, 2 years ago. So this image of the Black mammy was another stereotypical image that really downplayed and distorted the image of the African American farmer and the African American woman, especially, of being this caricature of a person. And we saw this not just in, you know, pancake flour, but we saw this on movies. We see this with Hattie McDaniel in her role in Gone with the Wind, and other individuals, and images that were displayed about African American women. It's a very discouraging time, and I don't think sometimes we understand the extent of these images and how they affect generations. That these two different examples have affected individuals for 3, 4, 5, 6 generations. And then the minstrel men. The minstrel men was another caricature that a lot of times we didn't even pay attention to. If you look to the right of your screen there, you'll see what's referred to in the movie Dumbo as Jim Crows. Have you ever watched those clips again? And I'm sure most of us watched Dumbo when we were growing up. I can remember back in 82, 83, it being re-released in the theaters. And I was a smaller child then. And going to the theaters and watching Dumbo and being excited by what's happening, but also seeing this scene of the Jim Crows. And if you listen to their dialect, it's very much a mockery of the African American man and African American community in terms of how they relate to each other. And this is again the image of Jim Crow. This was the idea of Jim Crow. You will see this later reflected in shows like Amos and Andy, Pigmeat Markham, and Stepin Fetchit, and some of the other caricatures that were done that would ultimately, you know, shape how we saw Black men. So these are individuals, or these are actions of psychological attack on the African American farmer and the African American image. Oh, in the world. Sorry, I hit way too many buttons here. Go back just a little bit. Sorry about that. So we're starting to see a rise and an increase in, you know, these attacks. And these attacks weren't just from a attack of these images, but also laws that were put into place, federal laws, especially, that attack the Black farmers and their ability to produce, and also providing resources to those farmers. So under Woodrow Wilson, president back in 1914, 1915, and during his presidency, ironically, the first live motion picture was shown, and that first picture was called The Birth of a Nation, first moving picture, which is a racist trope that really depicted Black men as white women loving, over-sexualized beasts. And this is the first motion picture shown in the White House under Woodrow Wilson. At the same time, Woodrow Wilson of Virginia is also putting in acts that would affect African Americans in their role in agriculture. So the first one was the creation of the National Agriculture Extension Service, which is a Smith-Lever Act of 1914. But in that act, there was a separate Negro Extension Service that had white administrators and was consistently underfunded. So we're already seeing an extension service set up, but in that extension service, you're seeing two paths that were separate and unequal. And the system is still partly in place today, where you have Virginia Cooperative Extension, and you have the Virginia State Small Farm Outreach Program, which is a separate program focused on small and socially disadvantaged farmers. Program I used to work for, so I'm very familiar with the program, but I'm also very familiar with their lack of funding. And we'll talk about that in just a little bit. The New Farmers of America was started as an alternative to the Future Farmers of America. That because of segregation at the time, there was no integration of farmers and farm organizations like this. The New Farmers of America was created As an alternative to that, there's a chapter in Carver Center or the Carver School, which my grandmother and great uncles and aunts and grandfather went to. And you also have a review of the Smith-Lever Act. And this really highlights, this is done in 2014, this really highlights the disadvantages that we saw and that Congress even had to recognize. And imagine this scenario in terms of funding and support for your community. I'm gonna read this briefly for you. The Smith-Lever Act, as you know, gave rise to the Cooperative Extension Program in 1914, which is a unique partnership between the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the land-grant universities. However, when the Smith-Lever Act was passed in 1914, it created extension at the 1862 land-grant universities. The act did not provide funding for the 1890 land-grant universities at the time. In 1972, Congress appropriated the first funding to support extension at the 1890 land-grant universities. So you talk about from 1914 to 1972, there's no funding for agriculture with these individuals, with these institutions, federal funding anyway. So imagine the type of disadvantage these 1890s have in comparison to the larger 1862 land-grant institutions, who are getting money every year per the Smith-Lever Act. So this creates a tremendous chasm of research and of opportunities for those who attend HBCU 1890s versus those who attend 1862 PWIs or predominantly white institutions. In addition to that, you have the Federal Farm Loan Act, which is kind of the foundational component for the establishment of the farm credit system that creates 12 federal land banks funded with $500,000 in that time period. That's not prorated. And they started to create cooperatives. So in 1917, farmers had developed 1,839 farm loan associations, 2,000 more in the process of developing, and 18,000 farmers received over $30 million in farm loans. By 1919, 4,000 farm loan associations. This is the start of what we know today as the cooperative system, where you have southern states, where you have Orange County, Madison Cooperative here in Orange County. You had these farm cooperatives that were funded by the US government, yet none of them serviced Black farmers. So you have a tremendous investment in agriculture, just not with African American agriculture in the 1920s. And this happens all the way up to the late 1960s into the early 1970s. So there's about a 50-year head start that these farmers are given, which is why we have such a tremendous gap between larger white farmers and smaller Black farmers, because we weren't given the same tools in which to grow our farm. We weren't given the same support federally to grow our farms. And then we move into the New Deal. And most of us think that the New Deal was pretty good. You know, it provided a lot of institutional or standards that we know today. And we're going to go through some of those laws. The Agriculture Marketing Act of 1929 creates Federal Farm Board. Agriculture Adjustment Act was the first agriculture subsidy issued to American farmers that encouraged farmers not to grow plants and paid them not to grow crops. The Emergency Farm Mortgage Act of 1933, which provided relief for certain farms from being foreclosed on during the Depression. Many of these acts, with the exception of the Emergency Farm Mortgage Act, could not be utilized by Black farmers. The National Housing Act of 1934 was supposed to protect housing in America, created a policy we know today as redlining, which restricted farm loans to certain individuals and stipulated certain conditions for who you could or could not sell to or buy from in terms of homes. And this was in 1934. The Social Security Act of 1935, as well as the Wagner Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, also discriminated against Black farmers or farmers in general. Social Security Act to this day does not cover farmers or farm workers. The Wagner Fair Labor Standards Act excluded farmers from the National Labor Relations Act in terms of safety, in terms of wages. There's no minimum wage on a farm unless you're an H-2A worker. In terms of ages, most of us who worked on farms worked on farms at a very young age. There was not you had to be 16 years or older to work on a farm. The reality is you can be at any age and still work on a farm. legally. So this kind of leads the way to, again, more mounted discrimination against these farmers. With the Bankhead-Jones Act of 1937, during the first 2 years of this act, only 987 loans were made to Black farm tenants. Out of the 43,000 approximately Black farmers that were in the state of Virginia, and about the 2 million Black farmers around the world, agricultural workers around the country at the time, only 987 loans were made to these individuals. I mean, a percentage of a percent was provided for these things. And this particular act created long-term, low-interest loans to tenant farmers for the purchase of land and equipment to allow these farmers to expand their operations through federal governments because of the Depression and the challenges they faced in the Depression. And this directly affected my family. Right here, you'll see a couple of gentlemen who, four of these gentlemen served in World War II. Actually, all these are my uncles, with the exception of the gentleman all the way to my left. That's my grandfather, Warren Harding Carter. You can see his draft card right below. His brother Roy, his brother Alfonso, my mother's uncle, and then my Uncle John. And these individuals gave all. They fought in World War II, the exception of my Uncle John, who fought in Korea, but they gave everything they had to their nation. And the only thing they received back for their GI Bill was a thank you, maybe, and then some technical assistance of training, usually in the vocations. So here you see 2 diplomas. Well, that was the extent of the GI Bill that was provided for my grandfather and my Uncle Alfonso, was these Department of Education diplomas on a vocational certificate in agriculture, which they were already very, very well versed in agriculture. But they could not qualify for home loans to buy homes. They couldn't qualify or didn't want to qualify for the educational loans because the educational opportunities at Black universities were much different because of the lack of funding Black universities received. They could not handle the influx of Black soldiers coming in with the students that would already be there. So with the GI Bill, there was numerous challenges with that with Black farmers and Black individuals, which many of them were Black farmers when they went there to war, and many of them had to return to be Black farmers when they came back from the war, because that was the only jobs that were usually provided for them. So in 1947, you're talking about 2 or more, no more than 2 of the 3,200 VA guaranteed home loans in Mississippi's 13 cities went to Black farmers or Black veterans. Fewer than 100 of the 67,000 mortgages insured by the GI Bill supported home purchases by non-white veterans. The VA encouraged vocational training instead of university admission. In a 10-year span, $33 billion went to US veterans, of which less than 5 million went to non-whites, leading to a greater racial wealth gap and disparity. And moving forward, just a little bit, the Evans-Allen Act provides capacity funding for food and agricultural research. This is to try to give fairness or equal funding to both 1890s and 1862s. And it's supposed to be a 100% match between legislators for this. In the red is the ones that are not 100% matched. So you see Virginia, you see North Carolina, you see West Virginia. As of 2012, they still haven't given a 100% match for extension services in terms of funding for both extension services. So even up to 2012, when this was created, there was still a disparity. I've heard that it's gotten better and that we're at 100% from some people. I would have to see the numbers to verify that. I just don't trust it personally. So 1965 moves around. Black American input has no really input in political policy. Secretary of Agriculture Freeman released a memorandum to his staff to put effect and dispatch comprehensive policies that would end discrimination. So this is around 1865, 1868. Civil rights movement is happening, and they're trying to at least in word end some of the discrimination that farmers are facing. But we fast forward. Let me see, I think I moved too fast there. Fast forward to 1996. Timothy Pickford and other Black farmers sued the USDA for discrimination. This was Pickford versus Glickman. This is the largest successful lawsuit against the government in U.S. history. $3 billion was roughly rewarded to Black farmers, but again, only touched the tip of the iceberg. And this is if you want some farmers to support. This is Browntown Farms here, Herbert Brown Jr. and Herbert Brown III down in Warsaw, Virginia. But this particular judgment, it sounded real good, but it was so not good for a lot of farmers. A lot of farmers did not receive information or news about Pickford, didn't qualify in time enough to receive it. And Pickford had two different tracks of payment once the payments were done. And granted, Pickford was won, I think in 1999, but payment was not awarded, I believe, until I want to say 2010, maybe. It was two different tracks. One track was $50,000, which is a blanket track, $50,000, and that was it. The other track was to pay off your debt to USDA through FSA loans. Very few people qualified. I'm about to say very few, I say less than 10 qualified for complete debt removal. Most of them only received $50,000 in payment, 13,000 or so. Received $50,000 in payment, but if you had a debt already of, let's say, $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 for your farm, $50,000 just didn't do enough to really save your operation. It allows you to pay down some debt, but the reality was it didn't help the situation. So a lot of farmers still lost their property because even after Pickford. So Pickford 2 was created, and this is Bernard Turner and his wife Latifah and his partner Ross C. Down in Louisa County, Virginia. So extension of Pickford 1, some of the farmers who found out about the class action suit from 1999, got late, received some compensation. This is Mr. Cliff Slade, who was an outstanding farmer down in Surrey County with his hemp crop there. And per the American Rescue Plan, this is the latest debt relief act that many of you all may have heard in various news reports on Fox News, on CNN, on MSNBC about debt relief for Black farmers under the American Rescue Plan. Reality, it wasn't debt relief for Black farmers, it was debt relief for social disadvantaged farmers. But Black farmers have always been cascaded as kind of the ones vilified, or at least the ones put up and used as bait and dog whistles for whatever party that you may be affiliated with, either as support or as an attack. At the time of that particular passing of the bill, 8,000 Native American and Alaskan Native farmers had the most debt with USDA Farm Service Agency. 26% of those were Hispanics and 18% were Black farmers. So Black farmers did not make up the majority of those who were receiving debt relief, but we were the main headlines for this debt relief package, because individuals knew we would draw attention. You say Black farmers need debt relief, you're going to get a lot of attention from the right and a whole lot of attention from the left. But again, we didn't make up, but 18%, less than 20% we made up of those individuals who actually received debt relief. And this is the current state of Black farmers today. We're at an extinction level event where we're down to less than 1% of where we were in 1925. Right now, farmers make up, Black farmers in the state of Virginia are roughly about 1,300 as of the last census, of the roughly 43,225 farmers in the state. So we make up less than 1% of the farmers in the state, and down by almost 98, 99% since our peak in 1925. So we're an endangered species, which is why I really, I speak a lot on this, because it's near and dear to my heart. I'm an 11th generation farmer. I want my sons to be 12th and my grandchildren to be 13th generation. I want them to keep this farming legacy alive, and it's critical that we make people very much aware of what needs to be done to support these farmers. These are America's original commercial farmers. And there's a great dignity and legacy and pride in the agriculture arena that we have to preserve. And the only way we can preserve is by action. And Malcolm X stated if you stick a knife in my back 9 inches and pull it out 6 inches, that's not progress. If you pull it out all the way out, that's not progress. The progress comes from healing the wound that the blow made. They haven't begun to pull the knife out yet. They won't even admit the knife is there. And that's a real thing for a lot of farmers and a lot of people. A lot of people would say, well, Black people, I've talked to people in various levels of administration in US and Virginia government that's in the current government, and they still don't acknowledge that there's a knife that's been there. And I hope that what I've shared with you over the last hour or so gives you some indication of the knife that's been put in our back and how deep it went. And many of us are now really pushing to pull that knife back out of us and allow us to heal so we can move forward. So I'm gonna give you some examples of how you can do this, as well as some solutions about going to this. Some of the things are just opening your mouth. When you go to a restaurant, you go to a local grocery store, when you go to a farmer's market, ask for protein and produce from Black farmers. And there's no produce and protein for Black farmers, ask for it from local farmers. Local farmers need support just as much as Black farmers. Well, Black farmers probably need a little more support, but local farmers need support too. Small farmers need support. We all need individuals buying from us because that's how we make our living. That's how we earn our living, by customers. So if you ask, you'll be surprised the type of momentum that comes from that. That even if they don't have it, you've put it on their mind that it's a priority to you. And for most folks, and I'm gonna take you back to North Carolina A&T where I went to school at, to my econ professor, Dr. Granger. He would say that we would vote with our dollar. Our dollar was our vote. So every day we go to the market, every day we buy something. We're voting to keep that business in business. And when you stop buying from those individuals, when you don't buy from those individuals, you're voting against them. So we want to encourage you to vote for the Black farmer every day. There are two GAP certified farms in the state of Virginia that are Black owned, and that's Goldman Farms and Willie Mae Farms. And you'll find Goldman Farms products usually in food lines in the state of Virginia and circulated throughout the country, or at least out the state. But Goldman Farms is a great farmer there. So if you ever see Goldman Farms in food line, they have a special section for local produce. Definitely buy those, whatever Mr. Goldman has produced. Willie Mae Farms mainly grows sweet potatoes, and they sell through various grocery stores in the region. They're usually not labeled as much, but it's buy sweet potatoes. You might get lucky and buy some Mike Combs sweet potatoes from Willie Mae Farms. One thing I always encourage individuals to do in terms of agriculture commodity, pay more and expect to pay more for local produce and Black-owned produce. That the days of trying to get a value for some of those things, this shouldn't be, because we have to value what we put in our bodies. This produce helps us fight cancers, keep us healthy, prevent diseases. And if you are trying to lowball it, you really discourage a farmer from actually growing it again. So pay more. We have to pay more for our food in our food system. It's critical. We pay more for gas, no problem. Right now, I think some of y'all are paying a whole lot more for eggs, which is a good thing, but we don't even know who's getting that money. But obviously the price went up and people pay more. They might not didn't buy as much, but we have the ability and the capacity to pay more for this food. Give to Black farming organizations and advocates. You can always give to myself, Africulture. We do a lot of work within agriculture education, with youth, with adults, within the agriculture community, and platforms like this. Any place I'm asked to speak, as long as I don't have a conflict in my schedule, I will almost certainly speak on these things. Happy Natural Day out of Richmond supports urban farming in Richmond and Petersburg. They have about 3 urban farms they're doing right now actively, training youth, training young people, and really training that midsection of individuals, 16 to 25. We always talk about the youth and the children, but it's that 16 to 25 that usually needs the most guidance, the most support, the most use of productive time. So Devon Chavis at Happy Natural Day does a great job there. Ebony Alexander at Black Family Land Trust is another great organization that promotes family property, keeping family property in the family, air property. Minority and Veteran Farmers of the Piedmont, which is a group of farmers I'm a part of out of the Piedmont area of Virginia. Hampton Urban Agriculture promotes urban agriculture in Hampton, started by two veterans, military veterans from the Navy, and they do a great job down in Hampton Roads and Newport News. Good Earth Therapy, another institution started by a military veteran, Brother Marcus Robertson, utilizes his agricultural programs as therapy for veterans to transition from military life into civilian life. So giving and donating to these organizations are a great way to start the process of the how. A lot of us don't always understand the why, or when we do understand the why, the next question we have to ask is how. And just like with anything, the why for us in terms of why we need to support Black farmers is, why do you need to buy American? In the same respect, you're buying and supporting a community that needs your support, that if you don't support them, you don't buy Black farmers, who will? And you're ultimately going to make us extinct by not doing so. And in many times, the reason why people don't buy from us because they're not conscious of the need to buy from us. So we're trying to increase the level of consciousness and awareness in terms of buying from Black farmers. So this is some of the how that we've incorporated with what we've done with Africulture and Carver Farms. We created a partnership between Aramark Corporation, who's a multinational, worldwide global food service provider, providing they provide a lot of produce, a lot of food service around the world. University of Virginia, 4P Foods is the local food distribution company and local food hub, which is based in Charlottesville. They've started to embrace the how. We started to explore how to provide great opportunities for Black and other minority farmers to provide produce through their institutional buying power. So this is one of the dinners that were inspired by a farm tour that we had, which you'll see pictures of in just a second. So this was done at UVA back in September to honor a great sister and a cousin of ours, Sister Edna Lewis. And it was sourced using majority Black-owned farmers or Black-owned farms. So you see there River Roots Farm. School lunch programs. School lunch programs, there is opportunities there. Our biggest challenge right now with school lunch programs is the time of year. When, and universities had the same challenge, but we've been able to manage that a little better. But the time of year for school lunch programs is usually from September to May. Time of year for farmers to farmers from May to September. So there's usually a hit or miss that we're not getting. So we work with various members of the state of Virginia and their school to lunch program. I've talked to their coordinators on numerous occasions. I've worked with them to try to help our farmers get into it. There's a few farmers doing that in Southside Virginia, down in South Hill area. But we're still trying to get the manual transmission to work right, trying to get that clutch with the gas and the brake so that we can get that car moving a little bit more. So it's something we're exploring further, but we haven't quite got that right. We also encourage those who participate in programs like this to pay more for the produce. And Aramark and UVA has committed to paying more for the produce from these farmers, which is also a great incentive for the farmers to provide for Aramark. I don't know if, and I haven't talked to the schools about that to see if that's the case, if they're going to be able to pay more, because at this point, for marketing purposes, for social media purposes, it's really not we really are trying to produce as much food as possible, but also get the most money possible for what we're doing. It's a business. So a lot of us, for us to stay in business, we have to definitely provide, or at least be able to get the maximum amount of money or revenue from our time that we put into producing the products. And the school lunch program is getting local foods, and it's a big push. There's a whole office set up in Richmond for this purpose, so they are getting local foods. It just hasn't been as many Black farmers that are that's participating in that program. This is a this is a farm tour that we organized with Aramark and 4P Foods, and chefs from Aramark going around to different farms and having conversations around agriculture, figuring out and learning about the different types of challenges these farmers have and face, and making our chefs and our buyers very much involved in the process of what's the reality on the ground and how they can help in a way that's meaningful. A lot of times when we get approached by larger corporations, or even larger, or just businesses in general, it's usually trying to make us cater to them. And Aramark and 4P has really tried to cater to the farmers, which has helped out tremendously in terms of providing produce. We started this Black Farmer Pipeline with UVA. We extended it down to Tuskegee University, through various universities in North Carolina and Atlanta or in Georgia. So we're pushing this program, this platform, to increase the number of Black farmers that are actively involved in providing produce to institutional bodies. And this is more from that dinner. And this is Brother Mark Davis of Real Roots Farm and Sister Amanda from 4P Foods and our 5-course dinner at Runk. And then one of the other opportunities that came out is actually me teaching a class at UVA on this particular subject, on Africulture. So this semester I'll be teaching, I am teaching with University of Virginia on this particular subject, trying to help raise the awareness and also create creative thinking and critical thinking around this subject about how do we maintain and sustain Black farmers, going through the history, but then working towards solutions to sustain us, support us. That we're just as critical as every other farmer in the nation in terms of being able to have a viable farm business. And agriculture is not easy for anybody, but it's extremely much more difficult when various things have been put against you over the last, 100 years or so. And another thing that we encourage individuals to do is to what I call obtaining a PhD, where it's purchase, hire, and deposit. I got a better slide than that. Let's see. So in 2023, we're trying to get our degree, our PhD in ancestry and legacy. One, purchasing for more socially disadvantaged farmers, ranchers, or vendors. Corporations spend hundreds of billions of dollars on their supply chains, and less than 2% is spent with Black businesses. So we constantly encourage purchasing from eligible Black and other minority-owned suppliers, as well as assisting in creating more eligible and minority-owned suppliers through mentorship and business counseling. These are little things that go a long way in terms of establishing support for these businesses and for greater communities. It's one thing to provide a fish to people, whole other thing to teach people how to fish. Some people don't have the pond to fish in. Some people like myself are vegan and don't want to fish. But we need still the resources to provide the type of solutions we need in our community. And this is one way of doing that. Hiring more employees of African descent, hiring businesses of African descent for your businesses or your employer, and then targeting service providers to support more African descent businesses. Providing, would it be caterers, would it be cleaners, businesses, et cetera, to be able to support your businesses where you work at, businesses you may own, things you may do in your homes. A lot of things we do in America, especially in this region, are relationship-based. And generally, we don't have relationships business-wise with businesses outside of what we know. And it's just how we're socialized in many cases. So I encourage everyone to, step outside the bounds and look for the SWAM businesses through Virginia, which is small women and minority-owned businesses, and work through those businesses to try to make them more productive. For smaller businesses, your business helps out a lot. And in working with smaller businesses, I always encourage patience and understanding in the process, because we carry a lot of weight. As a small business owner myself, I understand I miss some things, I may make some mistakes, and we need the patience of understanding that comes with that. And that patience helps us to continue to work through and learn from those mistakes. We don't make those mistakes again. It also keeps us in business. And deposit. And this is a challenging one because there's not a lot of places to deposit at this point in Virginia, but deposit into various Black-owned financial institutions. There's only 2 Black-owned financial institutions in the state of Virginia: the Virginia State University Credit Union, and then Richmond Legacy Bank, with Richmond Legacy Credit Union. And there's limitations in terms of VSU credit union because you have to be associated with VSU in some way to open an account there. And they only have one location, which is in Petersburg, Virginia. And Richmond Legacy is also challenged in certain ways as well. So that's something that we have to work on more. Industrial Bank is another bank that's utilized. I encourage people to invest in. Farm and Merchants Bank in North Carolina, Harbor Trust Bank in Baltimore, also Black-owned banks in the region. Yeah. M&F Bank. And then getting your postdoc. And I say this in jest, but I say this in seriousness, that, when we leave here, largest transfer of wealth is usually when you die. So providing, something in your will, something in your trust to the organizations like this that would need your support, need your help. Black organizations, Black individuals, Black churches that could utilize your contributions. It's critical that we start changing the paradigm around, wealth and how it's distributed, so that they can be more balanced and make up for some of these things. The reason why I have to have these conversations, not really focus on agriculture, is because our parents and our grandparents didn't have these conversations. They didn't have these discussions. They weren't open to having these discussions and ultimately open to working out these solutions. As I went through this history relatively quickly, the reality is this is something that's been ongoing and usually has not been talked about and really hasn't really started to be actually talked about since after the death of George Floyd, where it became, it kind of hit a head between the pandemic and his death and the social uprisings that happened afterwards. But we have to have more open conversations. That you can't solve a problem if you never talk about it, if you never discuss it, or never admit that it even is a problem. And you can't utilize a few individuals to say we don't have a problem. We all know there's an issue with this. And in this reality, we have to be open to have this discussion. I appreciate Ivy Talks for being able to share this. Generally, I try to do this in a space in person that we can have a discussion, but this is a great start of informing individuals about some of these challenges that we face historically and then how to move forward from this. That is not just about looking at the past, but also turning around and looking toward the future by establishing and applying some things in the present. As a farmer, one of the things I thrive on is planting a seed. So in planting seeds, you plant a seed today, not for tomorrow, but for tomorrows, for the next few decades. So we want to plant that seed. Now we're planting a seed with this, so hopefully my children don't have to have these conversations. They can just be Black farmers and not just, they can just be farmers and not Black farmers. So I want, as my elder here, Baba Adunu out of Washington, D.C. would say, there's no culture without agriculture. And it's with that I say thank you. I open myself up to any questions you may have. Hopefully I didn't talk too fast or go through these slides, go through this information too fast. I know it was a lot that I shared in a short period of time, but that's just the nature of what we do because of the time period allotted. But thank you for your time.
Thank you, Michael. I think Kay Swanson, do you have your hand up for a question?
Yeah, thank you so much for your whole presentation. That was just really informative and wonderful and spot on. And I'm going to follow up with my question about just whether there is a bigger challenge that we are having in America with farming in general because of globalization policies. And I say this as a native of Pennsylvania, where we had lots and lots of very fertile soils that have sadly become massive logistical centers. And there's finally pushback in Pennsylvania to stop taking up prime farmland and turning it into warehouses. I don't see that happening so much in Virginia, but it's always made me sad going up to Pennsylvania and seeing prime farmland get plowed over in a big giant logistical center. So it's a very more broad general question about whether farming in general has just gotten hard on a lot of levels.
Well, to answer your question briefly, but yes, it has. And the reality is we've been encouraged to scale up. The last agriculture secretary, Secretary Perdue, said, get big or get out. And that's been the kind of the mantra that if you don't get big, you need to get out of agriculture. That the small farm and the small farmer has been relegated to hobby farming, and not necessarily the backbone of food economies throughout the country. And farming, unfortunately, has become very politicized. The global reality is that, you know, a lot of promises that are made and a lot of deals that are done have farming components in them. So as much as we may be, you know, doing X, Y, and Z in a nation, we're also shipping corn, we're shipping rice, we're shipping soybeans to various nations, which disrupts local economies there and also our local economy here. Like I say, it's a very complex, but not complex answer, because the bottom line is it's about profits and shareholder value. And the more you have individuals or private corporations or public corporations having more access to land and more farms and more ways to produce through buying smaller farms, the greater shareholder value they provide for their shareholders, which allows them to have greater stock prices and ultimately greater wealth. And that's been the crux of American agriculture since roughly the creation of agribusiness in 1955. So that's, yeah, it's been an ongoing thing and it's only getting worse. There are still great stands of individuals and organizations trying to stop it, but the reality is, you know, the consumer has to stop it. The consumer has to be aware of what they need to do and how they need to spend. And we can do it if we're aware.
There's also, you know, the private equity world has suddenly found itself trying to get into the agricultural space because they could just sort of, you know, dictate what crops are going to sell well, and they'll be, you know, organic. And that is also taking, well, not just the autonomy, but I think the ability to know your local market better, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, it's unfortunate indeed.
Okay, you got that one. Do we have any other questions today?
And y'all a quiet crowd.
Well, Michael, I'm sorry we couldn't be in person today, but it did allow us to have folks from all over the instead of just right here in Charlottesville. So thank you so much for doing this talk today. It was very interesting, so informative. And thank you all for spending time with us this afternoon. We hope you enjoyed it and that you learned a lot. If you have not visited Ivy Creek Natural Area and Historic Riverview Farm, we hope that you will do so soon. We will have our March Ivy Talk on Wednesday, March 22nd at 6:30 p.m. Our speakers will be members from the minority and veteran farmers of the Piedmont. You can sign up for that event the same way that you did this one. As always, these talks are free and open to the public. And if you enjoyed this talk, we hope that you will support what Ivy Creek is doing for our community. Please consider going to our website and becoming a donor today, or going to Michael's website. And you want to put your farm website in the chat there?
Oh yeah, yeah. And I ended my I stopped sharing my screen too soon, but I need to put my.
There we go. And
let me give you my website as well.
Sorry.
It's okay. That's all right. Thank you for your time again. You continue talking. I'm good.
Okay. Thank you all for joining us today, and I hope you all get to enjoy some of this beautiful sunshine.